Your Winnipeg Jets are still the last undefeated team in the NHL, 6-0 after a big win over the St. Louis Blues, a game that showed where the Jets are strong and where there's still room for improvement. Let's chat about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, the Jets just beat the St. Louis Blues 3-2. It was a close game, but thankfully Winnipeg came out on the right end of the scoreline. Obviously, a big night in the NHL period, Frozen Frenzy, so lots of score lines where we're not really scoreboard watching, but certainly just curious about how some of our divisional rivals are doing. But this was the first time the Jets got a taste of the Blues, and let me tell you, the Blues feel like they're going to be a pain in the butt this season. I know the Jets won, but St. Louis did not make it easy. We'll talk a little bit about that in just a quick moment, but before we go any further, did want to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, before we also get into this, just wanted to let you know that I'm actually thinking of putting up our Kevin He interview tomorrow evening. We'll have a brief segment with him. I'm trying to pick out a couple of questions. I've gotten plenty from folks, so thank you so much if you've written something in. Obviously, we'll have a couple of broader questions, but just real excited to get Kevin on the podcast. And, with him having just been named captain of the Niagara Ice Dogs, really a really cool moment. And what fortuitous timing, right? He's had a great start to his season, so really excited for him and super happy that he's really finding success. But in the meantime, of course, the Jets are having their own success, and it couldn't have come at a better time with a 6-0 record to start the season and a 3-2 win against the Blues in pretty interesting fashion. This was actually a fairly solid game for the Jets. Not for everyone on the team, mind you, but I'd say that for the most part, Winnipeg did what it needed to do, and the Blues really gave the Jets some absolute fits. St. Louis is not as good as they were several years ago, but still an annoying team, and they were I think 4-2 coming into this game. So obviously, they're not exactly a pushover like they've been in previous years. And honestly, the Blues are never one of those teams that's super easy to beat. There's just something very pesky about them. Binnington usually does enough to make it difficult, and so this was going to be a tougher test for the Jets, one of their first real road games of the season, and they passed. The Jets had a pretty nice outing. And I think what stood out in this game, a couple of things. The Nemesnikov line with Perfetti and Ehlers continues to sizzle. And we'll talk about Perfetti's own performance in a little bit because I think it's worth spotlighting specifically. But, the Jets also just had, for the most part, across most of their lines, fairly solid performances. There weren't too many players who I think were, below break even. And so if you're looking at scoring chances and shots conceded, it was a pretty even back and forth affair. And the Jets, their best players ended up winning out for this one. So overall, really fun. It did start out a little bit alarmingly because the top line, unfortunately, got a bit cooked on a Brandon Saad goal. Neil Pionk tried to do something around the blue, like his own blue line, got caught. Nobody covered back for him, and Brandon Saad tucked one home. So that wasn't ideal. But then the Jets, of course, their power play, which has really come to life this season. It did take a little bit on the first one. It wasn't a great first power play, but then the Jets got another one, and Nino Niederreiter tipped home a great Pionk shot that ended up just going right by Binnington. Never had a chance. Niederreiter almost tried to swing at what looked like a fastball of a puck. Great little tip, really nice deflection. Niederreiter's second goal in as many games, and he has been what a wonderful find for the Jets. Niederreiter's been. I've always been a big fan of his, and sure, he doesn't finish on as many chances as maybe you'd like, but he has been such a workhorse for this team. He grinds in the corners. He's got a really nice balance of skill and physicality. So really happy with him. And, lo and behold, another assist for Pionk, who's up to 6 assists on the season. Neil having himself a pretty fun start to the year. I don't know if Arneal maybe took the Josh Morrissey lesson and decided to apply it to Pionk's game. Don't worry so much about defending, just go forward. And if that's what's happening, or maybe playing with Sandberg has an impact on it. Obviously Sandberg's a little more capable in transition and can kind of help ferry the puck up the ice. But overall, just a nice start to the year for him. We also had our first Colin Miller Jets goal. Colin, I've wanted in Winnipeg for a while, ever since he was a Knight. I thought he would be a really nice third pairing or maybe even second pairing defender, and he's actually paid pretty big dividends. He's up to, I think, 4 points now in 6 games. It's kind of crazy that he didn't get into the lineup really at all last year. He played 5 games for the Jets, which I just think was a mistake. This year, already proving to be a really, really smart re-signing, 2 years, $1.5 million per season. Honestly, he's exactly the kind of guy that I would have wanted the Jets to have targeted over the last few years. A great third pairing guy who, if you play second pairing minutes, you're not going to be mad. His partner Stanley did have a better game this outing than he did in his first game back, but I will say that the issues with Stanley by and large are still the same. It's when you start facing those skaters in the corners, in tight spaces, all that stuff where Stanley maybe can't pivot as quickly, that, he does struggle a bit. But, that's the same as it ever was. As a depth guy, I've always said that I'm not really upset about having Stanley around. I don't have an intense dislike of him. He seems like a nice kid. He works hard. And so for that reason, as a depth defender, I'm fine. But I just wouldn't want to rely too much on him throughout the year. Kyle Connor actually scored as well, and you know what? It wasn't the top line. Connor had a line change shift that just happened to have Nemesnikov and Perfetti, and would you look at that? Connor scores a peach of a goal on a great sequence of passing from Perfetti to Sandberg and then to Connor. What do you think about that? Does it remind you of something last year when Connor and Perfetti had a couple of games together and they were actually good? Yeah, maybe something, a little bit of food for thought for the future. But that kind of brings me to my final point about this game. The top line really hasn't been able to, in my mind, dictate play in the way that you'd like them to. They're not getting caved in necessarily, but they're also not really winning their matchups. It's interesting because in previous games they would get just crapped on. They're not really having that so far this start to the season, although we haven't faced as many tough opponents. I'd say Pittsburgh and St. Louis are the first teams to really put some serious pressure on the Jets, but I just feel like the top line is kind of showing that it's not super fast, and I think that is one of my biggest problems and why I've kind of advocated for Ehlers to be on that unit, is just because Connor Scheifele and Velarde, they don't move up the ice quickly, and I think it limits their upside together. And in this game, they actually were on the ice for both Blues goals and partly responsible for it. Not everything was their fault, but I just think it kind of goes back to what we've seen with this team and this particular line the last season and a half or so. It's just not really clicking for me. And I think if you make a tweak or two, this team is 6-0 and they're still not in their best form yet. So in my mind, if there's a time to experiment, it's probably now. And I do have some thoughts about the streak and some things I'm kind of watching for over the next few months with this team, later in this episode. But I did want to spotlight the Perfetti performance because I think it is really worth talking about and perhaps why I was so eager to push for a longer-term extension. We'll chat about that in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Through 7 weeks, we have our first real MVP frontrunner in Lamar Jackson. You've got some big surprises and upsets. If you're a Packers fan, you're probably enjoying Jordan Love's performance. If you're a Bucs fan, I am genuinely so sorry. Your season just took a real tough pill to swallow with both Evans and Godwin out for probably an extended period of time. At least Evans, I hope, comes back. I don't know about Godwin. He had a pretty rough injury, but Maybe you're a Commanders fan and you're really not feeling the pressure. Jaden Daniels obviously dealing with a small injury, but seems like it's not too serious. So congrats to him. Good luck. Let me tell you, the first game that I ever watched with him, I just suddenly understood why there was so much hype. His numbers may not blow you away, but the moment that you watch the way he does his progressions and stuff, you really start to feel like he is the future of the sport. And maybe you're watching him or somebody else and you get a hunch in the middle of the game. Well, on the same place where you place your bets, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, helping you make the most informed bets possible. And even better, you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's all at FanDuel.com. Get started today. Hey friends, welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everybody, thanks so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're chatting a little bit about some interesting developments through the first 6 games of the season. The Jets have a perfect record, flawless but still flawed, which I find to be a very interesting way of talking about this team. It's been fun. Like it's interesting because there's signs of growth, there's signs of some room for improvement still needed. But I think one of the most fun things that's been a really bright spot is Cole Perfetti's early performance. I have long been a Cole Perfetti believer. I've continued to talk about him as a player that I continue to think is one of Winnipeg's most important skaters. I know a lot of people are kind of like, I always overstate things, or maybe I make bold proclamations, but I'm telling you, Cole Perfetti is one of those players that I've circled on my I guess, short list of most valuable guys to this team's core in the future for a long time now. When he was drafted, I basically jumped. I could not believe Winnipeg somehow got him, and I think already he's starting to show why. After a slower start where he was a little bit rusty, he has suddenly really started to turn on the Jets, so to speak. He's already up to 7 points in 6 games. That probably exceeds even my best expectations. And, on the Nemesnikov line, where things were looking a little uneven for the first couple of games, it seems like he, Ehlers, and Vlad are all starting to get on the same page. And I think it's been, much, much, much smoother sailing. They're still working on ways to drive play a little bit at even strength, but I think their individual skill is carrying the day at the moment. And what I think is interesting with Perfetti is that, he's becoming a really two-way reliable force. The guy is defensively attuned. He's a super smart player, and he does it from a position that I didn't really expect him to play as a wing. But, he could either play as a center or a winger. Right now, he's as a wing. Interestingly, the Jets still list him as a center, and I think his performance is just going to continue to become a more critical part of this team's future. Against the Sharks, he had 4 points. Against the Blues, he had 3 assists. And he had almost 16 minutes of ice time. I know that Arniel in the offseason sort of talked about him as a really big part of this team. Until, the last game or two, I wasn't really sure how much I believed in Arniel in that, just because I felt like Perfetti's time on ice wasn't super reflective of a guy who is viewed as a really core member of this top 6. But it seems like it's starting to turn around. I really do think that Perfetti is going to be a very critical part of this Jets season. He had 38 points in 71 games last year, averaging like 13 and a half minutes. What do you think he's going to do this year when he's finally played with the right kind of skill and given prime deployments? I kind of thought he'd have like a 60-point season. He's already on pace to blow that away, so maybe he has some crazy year. I think it just also goes to show that the Jets maybe should have thought about a long-term offer. It's one of those things where, the Jets either felt like it was an unsafe gamble just because of his injuries, or because maybe Perfetti's camp signaled they wanted too much in a long-term deal. I don't know. It's interesting that they didn't really make an offer, but it is what it is, right? For the remaining year and a half that we've got him on this deal, obviously you get some fair bit of cap space that you can maybe use to allocate towards a big trade deadline acquisition, something else. Eventually, the bill's going to come due, and he's going to be very expensive, I promise you. But you got to pay your stars, right? You can only get away with cheap players for so long, and hopefully the Jets can settle on a deal with him that's a good fit for both parties. But on the whole, Perfetti's start to the season really fun. Ehlers also really starting to find his footing. I think Nick has been really creative. He's shown that slick passing and the vision and the skating that you want. Still kind of getting a few kinks out of his system, and I think the same can be said for Perfetti, but compared to the first couple of games, much, much, much improved. And Nemestikov has looked more like Nemestikov, still a little sluggish at times, maybe a little slower than you'd like. And I think you do wonder if maybe moving him out towards the wing position might be better. He also had some sort of a hand or a wrist injury in this game. So I would be curious to know if he's still playing as a center on Thursday. But this line is picking a really good time to start figuring things out. You really need them to be good because the Jets seem to be pretty married to Connor Scheifele and Velarde. And, I don't love that. I think that line hasn't really done enough to where I feel confident that they're going to continue to be decent the rest of the year. Ignoring the goals against part, I feel like maybe they don't quite deserve to have as many goals against as they do, but I just think it shows that, when you look at the way that they're playing and how they're creating their opportunities and whether they're really controlling their shifts, it's been tough sledding. Whereas the Ehlers, Perfetti, and the Nemestikov trio has been doing a lot more recently. They've looked more in control of their games, and Perfetti was arguably the best player on the ice tonight for the Jets, not named Hellebuck. So very strong game from Cole. I continue to believe that he really is a guy with a bright future for this team. I think the Jets will probably come to regret not getting him locked up earlier, but it is what it is. I suspect that his next deal is probably going to be at least $7.5 to $8 million. We'll see if he can stay healthy throughout all of that and if he continues to be this really fun player. But I will say the only thing that I kind of question is why the Jets don't always trust him with defensive zone draws. I feel like Cole is defensively attuned. He's very smart. In this game, people are going to point out towards the end of that third period when there was a bit of a slot scramble, it was Perfetti who made a really impressive read and made a huge stick lift that was not a penalty at all to basically take away what might have been a goal. I'm almost certain he actually did save a goal. If that shot or even the pass had gotten off, it probably would have ended up in the back of the net. So really, really critical play from him. And I think it just shows why I think he still has some of the best defensive value of any of our Jets forwards on this roster. I feel like Arniel should actually trust him with this stuff. His defensive prowess at times is even more impressive than his offensive skills. He's such a smart, heady player. He can read these plays. He senses where the danger is. And oftentimes, what really stands out, whether it's in years past or this season, is that he'll jump those routes, he'll force turnovers, he'll make a puck carrier's life very uncomfortable. All that kind of stuff that sets you up for success, he's doing. He's a very details-oriented player, still has some things to work out in this game as he's a young player who's finally getting some healthy reps, but overall, I just really come away impressed with Perfetti, as he continues to grow. And, for being a 22-year-old, he exudes a lot of patience and maturity, and I am super excited about his ceiling. It wouldn't shock me one day if he starts getting up to 70-plus points. I think he has that potential. I think he's skilled enough to do it. I guess it's just a question of will he, remain this hot? Will he continue to be a real important role player for this team? Will the coaching staff recognize his value, and can he stay healthy? Sort of on that note, I do wonder what happens as the season wears on and Arniel starts trying to hard match at home. Does he use this line as much? I hope he does. If it continues to play this well, make it a meritocracy. Make it a situation where this line earns more shifts. They did in this game, and I don't know if it's because he couldn't control, the hard matching like he can at home, but I will say that it did seem like he just trusted the Perfetti line a bit more than he did in the last game. And so that makes me happy. I think they deserved it. I think they've started to really pull things together, and I hope that continues because the Jets kind of have some other areas where they're still trying to figure things out, and I think that's where, having a couple of lines that you already trust, that you can rely upon, and that have generally done the job quite well, can give you some room to experiment. If you've got some guys that are already producing, maybe work on those couple of changes that might turn your team from being very good to like a true juggernaut. I think that one shift that we saw where Connor scored with a Perfetti connection, just to me, shows that this team still has ways it can make this roster and lineup even more optimized and make it a team to be feared. The Jets don't have to have like the craziest, most broken assemblage of talent, but what they do need to do is make sure that their lines are optimized. The more you do that ahead of time and the more you set yourself up for success, the better off your life is going to be when you start rolling into April, May, and you're looking at the real, your real playoff run and what you're hoping to get out of it. If you set yourself up early this season with success and chemistry and familiarity, it can only make things better down the road. So something to keep an eye on and see how that trend develops. But speaking of, trends with this team and stuff, I thought I'd chat a little bit about, Winnipeg so far, first 6 games. How do we feel about this team? How sustainable is this run? We've talked about it a little bit on previous episodes. Thought, we take a little closer look at some of our standout performances and guys that I'm still wondering a little bit about. But before we go too much further, did want to shout out our friends and partners at Indeed. We're driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform that helps you ditch the busy work by helping you schedule, screen, and message so you can connect with top quality candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers who use Indeed agree Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites. As somebody who has actually used Indeed for work myself, when I was looking for a job, I can personally attest to the fact that the resume builder is comprehensive. It's very detailed. It's easy to fill out. And the best part is when you put all the information in, you start going through job listings, it actually matches stuff to what you're interested in, whether it's your discipline, your work experience, maybe some specific qualifications that are required, and your salary requests, which makes it very easy to find jobs that not only fit you, but that you fit as well. So it's a great two-way street. It's wonderful. And I can only imagine that if you're an employer looking to hire top quality talent, this has to be one of the easiest platforms you can use. And with over 3.5 million businesses worldwide using Indeed already, you really should consider joining them. Listeners of the show will even get a sponsored $75 job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on the Locked On Winnipeg Jets show. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just closing out with some interesting stuff on Winnipeg's 6-0 start and how the team has generally done so far. I think it's been an interesting ride to a perfect record. Obviously, 6-0 by any metric is just impressive. It's the best start in franchise history. The Jets are the last undefeated team in the league. And what I think really makes 6-0 special, 6-0-0, I should really be specific here, but what makes the perfect start especially remarkable is that, the Jets haven't actually controlled and dominated in a lot of these games. They've played some stretches of really good hockey, but for the most part, they're not really like crapping on opponents, right? They're not burying them in the traditional sense. They've been back and forth in a lot of these games, and it shows that where they're at right now is not their final form. And I think that is really exciting. It also makes me wonder if Arneal knows which sorts of levers he wants to pull to get this team to that next level. Right now, the Jets are kind of like a so-so 5-5 team, really good on the power play, and the PK seems to be doing a fair enough job. Obviously, the power play and PK aren't going to be perfect forever. They're going to have some moments where, maybe you'd wish they'd make a different decision or something. But the Jets PK killed both of their opportunities tonight. The Jets power play scored on one of the two, and it just continues this trend of Winnipeg special teams being pretty nice this year. The power play is operating at a little over 40% right now, which is just, it is a very small sample size, but that's just really friggin' crazy. I know the Sharks game kind of inflated that a little bit, so let's pump the brakes on saying it's going to operate at 40% for the entire year. But I will say the power play looks dangerous for the first time in I don't know how many years. It's been a really long time since our man advantage genuinely threatened teams. And when you have the man advantage with an average PK and really good goaltending like the Jets do between Hellebuck and Comrie, you might actually be able to get pretty far in the season. I've kind of maintained since the start of the year that I do think that this Jets team, even before the first game was played, would be a playoff team. Like, even with the departures and my own concerns about how Arniel might manage the bench and how he might make the lineups this year, I still felt the Jets would make the postseason. Maybe as a wild card, maybe as one of the 2 or 3 seeds in the Central. I wasn't really sure about maybe winning the Central. It looks like the division could be a little more wide open this year than anticipated, so that's great for the Jets. But at least, bare minimum, I thought this team would be a wild card team, and I think so far they're kind of pacing towards that. I know that they're 6-0, and I think or 6-0-0, and they're flawless right now. But eventually, some things will probably start to creep in. I think the biggest thing that I'm worried about long term, and it's not really a worry, it's more like something for improvement, is just the top line. The top line plays a lot, and you really rely upon it to carry the rest of your matchups, right? If the top line isn't really winning and dominating, it makes it harder to trust them, makes it harder for them to go out in high leverage situations, and that makes Arniel's life a little more tricky. But I think, with how good the depth lines have been, Winnipeg can probably afford the top line to be like break even for the remainder of the next few weeks and months, unless something really changes and suddenly they can't do the job anymore. I think my own personal preference is that you start thinking about Ehlers on the top line now, just because eventually the Jets are going to start facing more and more playoff teams. I think the one benefit to Winnipeg's start is that they now have a fair bit of cushion with a 12-point early start, that they can experiment a little more, they can mess around, they can try some things, and I think that that's a great benefit to having such a hot start and banking so many early wins. You can now kind of tweak and adjust as you think might be appropriate to get your team into an even more dominant state, and that's where I think I'm at. Right, it's not that I think the Jets are bad or anything. It's more like I can see so much potential and room for growth for this team to go even further, to be an even stronger squad. And if you have a top line that's just winning matchups left and right, even if they're not scoring, they're just controlling and wearing down your opponent, that makes everybody else's life so much easier. And when you know that Perfetti and Connor already have good chemistry and Nemesnikov is looking like he can keep up, it makes it, in my mind, not that much of a stretch to perhaps make a couple of switches. You switch Connor and Ehlers, and I think you're going to have one of the most dangerous top nines out there, because the Lowry line, you never really have to worry about them. Even if they don't score, they usually just bulldoze their opponents. And if you have the top 6 really soft-hitting opponents and the Lowry line coming in to finish the job, that just makes it really hard for opponents to do anything. And then, you've got a fourth line that just shuts opponents down. They're really energetic, they're defensively responsible, and offensively, they actually create tons of chaos in the slot. It's why I think that this team it's closer than I thought it would be to being a really, really good team. I think as it is right now, they're really solid, and, at times they can be very good. Against better opponents, I think we still need to see a little more from some parts of this team, but it's getting there, right? There are, as in all things, right, some changes that can probably help this team, and I'm curious to know what Arniel's assessment is. But, again, if they just continue on as they are right now, I think it'll get them reasonably far. I just think once you hit the playoffs, that's where some of these changes might be a little more helpful. But I'm sure the Jets are probably going to stay the course, keep things going as is, and just wait until something really forces their hand, which, I get. And in some ways, I don't hate that plan either. But, I'm always forward thinking. I'm always thinking about the future. And one sort of underrated part about maybe getting Ehlers some more ice time and making him a more focal point of this team is because he is a free agent. He doesn't right now have loads of incentive to stay. And I think a lot of Jets fans are going to have a hard wake-up call once he leaves, if he does leave. I don't want to say it's guaranteed, but, you kind of need to make a really compelling reason for him to stay. And his current deployments and usage probably aren't doing that so far. But games like these maybe start pushing more in that direction. So let's just hope that, the Jets recognize where they're strong in, where they still need to do some work, and make the right changes and get this team into a truly competitive, really strong state. They're like halfway there already, right? couple of changes, and I think you're absolutely cooking with gas. So a lot of fun stuff ahead. I'm excited. And of course, tomorrow we get to talk with somebody who's going to be, in my mind, a big part of Winnipeg's future. At least I'm hoping. Kevin, he seems like he's loving the start to his season. So, excited about that. But let me know what you think of the current 6-0 run in the comments below, or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow with our kind of Kevin He interview and maybe some more current season thoughts. But for tonight's show, that's all the time that we have. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great night, and go Jets, go.